Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Film Chat Show. Today I will be talking to an upcoming horror director to talk about his new film, but first I will talk to him about the horror genre. So would you please welcome Chris King.
Hello.
Hello.
It's very nice of you to have me on, thank you.
We all know that horror is a very changing genre.
Yeah.
It changes like from year to year depending on what's happening. So can you tell us about the roots of the horror
Yeah,
genre?
sure. Well, the horror genre, like most people think it started with the talking films in the 1930s,
Yeah.
when it, like such films as Frankenstein or the very gothic horror films that started it. But they weren't. In the late 1890s was one of the first silent horror films.
Yeah.
Made by a man called George Méliès. He made a series of short horror films that were the silent ones, and he was not alone in making them though, because at the time as well, Japan had also made quite a few ones. One of the most noteworthy is Babe Shizo, which is one of the first silent horror films that was made along that time though.
Yeah.
But after these came like quite iconic monsters that are still used today. So you've got monsters like Frankenstein and Quasimodo,
Right.
monsters that everyone associates with like 1930s B-movie ones, with Boris Karloff playing Frankenstein. But actually, the first depiction of Frankenstein was in 1910 by Edison Studios, and Quasimodo was one of the first monsters to appear in 1906 in a film called Alice's Guide. But later in that century, Hollywood took hold of horror films, which is how they really started getting made. So you've got Hunchback of Notre Dame, Monster, films like that.
Yeah.
Which are, then you've got other iconic ones that everyone's heard of, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And you've got The Phantom of the Opera, which is the musical. So it didn't really start with the gothic horror like everyone thinks it did. It started with stuff before that, and then, as you said, horror evolved. So later and later and later, films began to change. Two of the most important ones in the 1950s and 60s were the demonic and the Armageddon horror ones with zombies. And so you got films like Night of the Living Dead, which was one of the most iconic ones in the 60s of a zombie film. But the 60s also saw the start of slasher ones as well. One of the first slasher films was made there. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which is a very iconic and
very popular
horror film. But the possession horror started in the 50s and 60s, like I said, but it really came to full front in the 70s, with films such as The Exorcist making horror not the B movie like it had been before, but A movie instead, so they were more popular, more budgeted. They had more of a special effects and CGI and stuff that could be used as the bigger budget. But in the 1990s, horror sort of stalled because the generation that had been built up on slasher films and all films like that began to get not bored, but they grew up and the new generation wanted something different. But horror.
I was about to say, because slashers can get a bit repetitive, can't they? And you know what to expect. Whereas when they've got a bigger budget and when they're like psychological, more like evolved type, you don't know what to expect anymore.
Yeah. So instead of doing the serious horror films in the 1990s, they went with more parodic and ironic horror films. Like you've seen Scary Movie.
Yeah.
So in the 1990s, saw the first of that. So you've got Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, which was like a parody of Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead. So you've got films like that.
Some of the best horror films have been like zombie rom-coms, like Shaun of the Dead, and that was really funny. Going into speaking about directors, because you're the director of your new film, what famous directors inspired you in your work?
There's been many great directors, but I've already mentioned one of them, Alfred Hitchcock. He was more of a thriller director than a horror director. So I thought he brings like something very unique and pulling to a horror film which had never been done before, was to make it like suspenseful.
Yeah.
So with films such as Psycho, as we've mentioned, they were really good thriller films for him. So they brought something different to the horror genre. You've got factual horror films as well, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre,
which is based on a true story. Yeah.
That was what was so scary about it, the fact that it was made to appeal to the horror audience, but most horror films are fictional.
Yeah.
But for something like that to actually happen, it makes it far more scary.
Very realistic as well.
Yeah.
As you're creating your film soon, and you need to release it, you're releasing it in the coming about October time, sort of thing.
Go with the Halloween.
Go with Halloween, yeah. What rating, certificate rating would you give it?
Well, we're going to give ours a 15.
Right.
To appeal to a wider audience and to get that teen market, because teens the majority of what go to see horror films.
Yeah.
But for it to be a 15, we've got to make sure it doesn't fall into that 18 category, so we can't make it.
Is it going to have loads of gore, like a zombie film, or is it going to be?
Well, obviously we've got to include some gore, because that's an integral part of horror these days. We can't include too much, so you can't include like incredibly vicious and but we can also the ratings are more, I don't know, not strict, so we can use bits from, but as long as it's not fully 18, so we can still use strong language, which will make it more realistic, as people do these days.
They're a lot easier to have a lower rating these days, because in like the 1960s, I mean, anything that you'd see in a typical 15 now would be an 18, definitely.
Probably wouldn't have even been allowed.
Yeah, exactly. So,
I mean, Psycho was an 18 at its time, and that's not.
I think we've come along a lot
we've come on a lot.
Since the 60s at least, so yeah.
But for our film, I mean, I know we're not going to use it in our film, but you can still use sexual nudity in 15s these days, whereas for it to be an 18, it needs a proper strong sense of horror.
Well, I think the youth are more like knowledgeable of like nudity now, so it's not as a rarity.
But for it to be an 18, it needs to be incredibly like graphic, which I don't want to do, because your imagination in my mind is always more scary and more dramatic than seeing it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the magic. If you see it, it just takes away from it, I think.
And also, because I mean, you're on here to promote your movie, obviously, but you haven't. I mean, horrors don't need a massive budget.
No.
And of course, if it's down to your imagination, then
I mean, you've got films like Jaws as well, where you never actually saw the shark until the end, and that made it a lot more scary.
Because you didn't know what to expect, so it's what you didn't know.
So.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, and I'll discuss my film later with you.